Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our training session. This is our fourth session is part of the leadership training series. Just want to thank you all for being here. I see some folks who have been on three other sessions with us so far, so thank you for your commitment to this. I, of course, want to thank our presenters, Dean Mark Norman, Edward Faustin, and I think we'll be joined by Kendra shortly. But before going into any other remarks, I just want to note we have a special guest, so I will pass it to our borough president.
Thank you so much, Eric. I don't know why I think I need permission to go on video, but if not, we can do voice only. Anyway,
You should
I
be able
am
to now, I think.
okay. There we go. Excellent. Um, Coming you from live from 33rd Street. I am so excited about this session. You get to hear from some of the smartest people in housing finance in New York City. And I've had this training, my team has had this training, and we wanted community board leaders to have it as well. So much of our energy on what we call housing policy is really about land use and zoning, which is the question of what you can build, but none of that really helps anyone if we don't actually build the housing. And to actually build, we have to have financing in place, which is extra challenging when we want to build affordable housing, as we do. So I have always felt that we've had a gap among policymakers in understanding what it takes to actually finance the housing that we need, especially affordable housing, to get it built, to deliver for people. And that's what this training is about. So this is not about R7 versus R6, as most of our conversations are. This is about what it takes to actually finance the housing that the city needs. So we've got experts for you. You're going to learn a lot from. I'm really excited to see the turnout already. Thanks everyone for being part of this tonight.
Thank you, Borough President. Appreciate your opening remarks. Yeah, we're really excited about this training. I know he was just talking about R7 versus R6. If you are interested in that conversation, later this week, we are going to have a basic land use and zoning training as well. So I would encourage folks to sign up for that if you haven't already. Um, right now, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know that we have a lengthy presentation, and I'm really excited to dive into it. Um, I just want to pass this over now to Porfirio Figueroa, who really is an incredible part of our team who makes sure that these sessions flow, as well as Don Billings. But Porfirio, I will pass it to you to do some introductions.
Thank you so much, Eric. And it's really wonderful to be here. Give me 1 second. I just want to slide this over. Uh, yes, we are joined today, but well, let me introduce myself. My name is Porfirio Figueroa. I'm the community coordinator for the Manhattan Board President's Office and liaison to community boards 11 and 12. Um, and I am here to introduce Marc Norman, who is the Larry and Clara Silverstein Chair in Real Estate Development and Investment and Associate Dean of the Schack Institute of Real Estate at New York University. A renowned urban planner and a veteran in the field of community development and finance, Norman also is the founder of Ideas in Action, a consulting firm. Before coming to New York City in NYU, correction, in July 2022, he was an associate professor of practice at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, where he also served as faculty director of the Weiser Center for Real Estate at the university's Ross School of Business. A former Loeb Fellow, Norman also has extensive experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors and has worked collaboratively with to develop and or finance over 2,000 units, totaling more than 400 million in total development costs. Marc tonight will also be joined by Kendra Stensven and Ed Faustin, who will introduce themselves. Marc, it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to have that opportunity to introduce you. Welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I really want to thank the borough president and his staff for having this series, Porfirio especially for pulling us all together. and also my fellow faculty members, Kendra Stensven and Edward Faustin, who will be joining me today. And I know our time is relatively short and we have quite a bit to get through, so maybe we'll start. I'm going to start with kind of an overview, and then I want to pass it to Kendra, who will then pass it to Edward. But let's get right to it. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you will all be able to view this. Well, I'll try that. Okay. So, once again, we are all faculty at NYU, but also practitioners. In policy, in finance, in development, in real estate. So we're really happy to join you. In some ways, we're all experts in housing and finance because we all have to live and interact with our built environment. So I want to make this as interactive as possible. So I hope we have an active use of the chat as we go along. There's a little bit of an exercise we'll work on with you as well as we work through this. But also, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat as we go along, and we'll try to get to your questions for sure during this presentation, because I'm sure questions will come up. So as Porfirio said,
Forgive me for
Marc, go
interrupting
ahead.
just a second, Mark. So the questions can go into the Q&A feature because we're in webinar format. So the questions can go into Q&A, and then they will be monitored and reviewed by Eric.
Perfect. Thank you. Just a little bit about my background. Porfirio talked about it. I'm on the New York City Housing Development Corporation Board, in addition to a couple of other boards. And in all of these jobs and places I've been, housing has been really the main topic that we focus on because it affects how we live in the city and how we get things done, especially affordability and the lack thereof really has an effect. So it's important to us. So I wanted to just start with a couple of current housing statistics, kind of where we are. As many of you know, we have one of the lowest residential vacancy rates we've ever had, 1.4%. That is probably in the level of crisis. That means we don't have enough units at the right rents for the majority of people that live in New York. So that's one big issue. We also have over a 330,000 unit deficit of housing units. We haven't built enough housing. We have 146,000 people sleeping in shelters, right? So that's also talking to this need for housing. And our housing stock is relatively old, most of it built before 1947. And really not much built, after even 2010. So we're building less housing, even though it might seem like you see lots of cranes in the sky, we're building less housing than we did traditionally. And the housing that we do have is relatively expensive. So we've lost our most affordable units, either to rent increases, to different configurations, and it's hard to rebuild housing at the price that's affordable for the current median incomes in the city. And we have 75,000 units since 2000 that are over 5,000 a month. And the averages are going up in terms of average rents for studios, ones, twos, and three bedrooms. And what that means is many New Yorkers are rent burdened, and that's defined as New Yorkers paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And then extreme rent burden is people that pay over 50% of their income on rent. I think we've really defined the problem, right? And the question is, how do we get out of it? Well, we have to build more housing, and we have to build more housing that's affordable to the people that live here and work here. And with median rents at 3,500, that requires an income of over 140,000. So we have to do other things to bring the price of housing down so that people can afford it. If you see also at these high prices, many of the people coming into the market are selling existing residences or coming in with other wealth that lets them pay all cash. Let's talk first about just the style of housing. So I just want to cover, we'll be talking about a number of different housing styles, but mostly um, multifamily rental, because that's where our programs and our finance mechanisms are focused, because that can have the biggest impact. But we do have single family, row house, walk-ups, elevator buildings, and mixed-use residential. And all of these different types of housing have different zonings and different ways that they're financed and constructed. Um, so we just want to make sure that you have that sort of in your mind. And then also within that, like, what are the ways that housing types play out in the city? So single family, accessory dwelling units, duplexes, modular housing, manufactured housing, small multifamily buildings, and large multifamily. So once again, all of these different styles are regulated differently, financed differently, inhabited differently. So we just wanted to lay out the types of housing before we got into some of the specifics. We also then have types of tenancy. So ownership, rental. So ownership could be cooperatives, condominiums, single family, rentals, many types, subsidized, unsubsidized, market, subsidized in various ways, mixed income, meaning buildings that have affordable and market rate units, all market rate units, and rent stabilized units. And then we have a whole other category of sort of congregate care. So that's shelter beds, transitional and assisted living. So also just wanting to understand sort of the totality of types of tenancy, because those will also affect the way we finance, build, and get housing done. So now that we have that, what are some of the components of development? Well, we need land. We need someplace to put the building. We need infrastructure, right? So that's really the sidewalks, the underlayment, the foundations, and the things that make sure that the building can function. Labor, of course, hard costs, which are the costs of actually constructing a building, and then soft costs. So that's everything else. That's your lawyers, your attorneys, your accountants, your permits, your fees, your insurance, all of those other things. So hard costs and soft costs are the costs that go into building a building. And all buildings have to have a contingency. So what happens if something goes wrong? We have to reserve money for cost increases or unforeseen things, and then reserves if something goes wrong on the operations side. So there are a number of components to the development. So in saying all of this, what I want to talk to you about is just when we look at buildings, they have different components, different tendencies, and different ways of being built. So we just wanted to just have a kind of background on what that is and what that looks like. If you have any questions about any of these things, please do put it in the Q&A, and we'll kind of go further on these things. But I wanted everybody to at least have a baseline on what the components are of a development. So now that we know what a building's made up of, land, infrastructure, labor, hard costs, soft costs, what are the components of financing? Well, debt, which loans from banks or other financial institutions. So that's going to be one big component of a development, right? How much can we borrow so that we can build? But equity is another big component. So that's the money that comes from the developer or other investors, because the bank is never going to lend 100% of the cost of building a building. So the money that is basically at risk that a developer or their investors have to put up. And when those two components don't work, we need subsidy. So that's to make the building feasible. That's to make the building affordable. And where the city, the state, and the federal government comes in is incentives. So if we're giving that subsidy, what are we giving it for? Are we giving it for affordability? Are we giving it for public access? Or are we giving it for other things? So the components of the financing can comprise many things, but in big four buckets. It's really loans, equity, so the money at risk from the owner, developer, investor, subsidy, if it doesn't work in terms of being feasible, and incentives to give the things that we want to see in our city, whether it be affordability, waterfront access, et cetera. So once we build the building, we then have to operate it. So what are the components of operations? Management. So that's staffing, insurance, taxes, utilities, repairs, and staffing. So that then means that the rents we collect have to pay for that ongoing cost of operating a building. So let's just keep that in mind as we go through this exercise here. And then what's the life of a development, right? So we know that land is important. Well, we have to acquire the land, right? So the first phase is acquisition. So how do you acquire the land? Then you do the pre-development. So that's, what is the zoning? How do we get it built? How do we get the permits? What is the building going to look like? Enlisting the architect. We can move to construction, constructing the building, leasing up the building, and then operating the building. So just thinking about the life cycle of a development, and this process can take anywhere from 1 to 7 or 8 years, right? Depending on how long any one of these components take. So we just want to have a general understanding of the life cycle of a development. So what does New York City look like? So we talked about the different kinds of housing. We're a majority renter city. So co-ops and condos, which are ownership, make up a certain percentage. But the majority of, especially in Manhattan, are rentals. And those rentals are separated into a number of different types. Rent stabilized units, post 73 and pre 73, rent controlled units, which are a very small portion, public housing units, regulated rental units, meaning our affordable subsidized units, and then our market rate units. So just understanding that as well is important in terms of looking at sort of how we finance housing and how we make it affordable. So a question I get a lot is, what is affordable housing? And we actually have very particular, strict definitions. So affordable, you can be at any income. It's affordable if you're not paying any more than 30% of your household income for housing. So if you're above that 30%, the federal government basically states that if somebody's paying more than 30% of their income for housing, they're rent burden. That means that they have less money for all the other things one might need in life: childcare, schooling, housing, payments of any kind, groceries, etc. And we have a very specific way of looking at it. So very low income is somebody at 30% of the median income for New York City. The median income for New York City is $155,000 for a family of 4. So what we can do is, once we know that number, we can determine what is affordable. So very low income, affordable, 100% of the median income, all the way up to market rate. And I put here, just for reference, the current categories of income in New York City today. So if you have an annual household income, you're a family of 3 in a 2-bedroom apartment, and your annual income is $46,000, you're about 30% of the median income. You shouldn't have a monthly rent over about $1,050. If you have an income of $77,000, you shouldn't have a rent more than $1,700. We know many people have rents much higher than this, but when we do affordable housing, we're really trying to figure out how we can get people in housing that doesn't burden their income and that is stable for them. So this is a way to lay it out, and we can do that for any income. So we can take anybody's income and decide what the appropriate rent should be, and that's how we would determine affordable housing. So I've done a lot of writing on this, and I certainly haven't solved the housing crisis, but I think in all working together and going through exercises like this, we can collectively think about the ways that we can make housing more affordable. So this is what I think one might think of as traditional affordable housing. This is a public housing complex on the Lower East Side, but we don't build housing like this anymore. This was housing that was built in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, government subsidized, government supported. We moved away from that model. And so in many people's minds, they don't see new affordable housing being built. It's being built quite a bit, but it looks very different than this housing. It looks more like this now. So this is Villa Verde in the Bronx. This is a rehab on 135th Street. So previously market rate that was preserved and rehabilitated to become more affordable and have rents that were affordable to the neighborhood. Buildings like El Barrio Gardens in East Harlem. So what's the difference between these buildings and the public housing buildings of yore? We're incentivizing private developers, whether for-profit or nonprofit, to include affordable units in new developments or in rehabilitated developments. So it's a real switch. And so what that means is, as we go around the city, it's not clear where the affordable units are and which buildings are affordable. And when a developer in New York City builds these units, they're supposed to scatter the units throughout the building. So you wouldn't necessarily know which units are more or less affordable, which ones are market rate. And that's the way that most affordable units are built today. So I'm just going to go over one example. So this is a development I worked on quite a while ago. And to me, it gets to the question of how do we actually get housing built, right? We don't have a lot of land left. So we look at, when you look at rezonings and you look at other sites, these are some of the opportunity sites we have, but they have real problems, right? So this site in particular in Williamsburg, right across the river from the East Village, was an industrial site. So the value was actually negative. It took $30 million just to remediate the land and the environmental harm to get housing built. So this became a 134 unit affordable housing development. And it also included market rate. So this is on the Williamsburg waterfront. So it took a rezoning. It took 25% affordable, which was mandated. So those are those incentives that we give in order to get better outcomes for people in neighborhoods. This also included a waterfront esplanade. For including additional affordable, there was a bonus, so the developer got to build higher and denser because they included more affordable units, right? So in addition to the developer getting that density bonus and the housing being affordable, there was also subsidy from the housing department, low interest loans, tax credits from the state, and a tax abatement on the entire property, right? And so all of these things played into how we get housing built. That housing would never have been built on this site without those incentives, because in order to even start the development, you needed the money to do the environmental remediation, and you needed the money for the infrastructure, and you needed to make it feasible. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking at today. So I just want to go over one more example. So this is actually a building in Harlem, and it was a development that was a rehab of an existing building, in addition to new housing that included shelter beds. So when we talked about different types of housing, this housing has transitional housing, shelter beds, as well as multifamily units and family-sized apartments. But what does it take to get a building like this done? So the Fortune Society did it. It's called Castle Gardens. It had a developer. The mayor's office supported the formerly homeless residents. The state came in with funding. And then it took a whole host of others in terms of lenders, developers, investors, contractors, architects to get these buildings done. So it's not just one entity, right? Especially when buildings are affordable, it takes so many different entities to get a development off the ground. So when we talk about how these buildings get built, that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. And we talked about equity, but I just wanted to share some of the components that go into development. Kendra will talk specifically about programs. Ed will talk specifically about a deal. But one of the things that we wanted to convey to you is what are the ways that a deal gets put together and what's the way it works. Um, so we have to figure out the value. We have to figure out what we call the capital stack. So what is that mix of sources that makes the property feasible? That mix of debt and equity and assistance and subsidy and incentives, um, so that we can pay those hard costs and those soft costs, right? Um, so if we look at a building here, this is a building called the Ellery on 43rd Street. Um, this just completed this past year. But when we look at how a building like this gets built, it's not easy today to get buildings built in New York, right? In terms of labor costs, financing costs, we all know the issue with increased interest rates. Um, Post-COVID, so many different issues have to go into getting a building done. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this building. And these are the numbers for this building. It's 330 units. The average unit is 750 square feet. And then it takes all these components to get it done, right? So site work was $21 million. That's building the foundations, that's building the subcellars, the basements, the sidewalks, the hard costs, the labor, the steel, the plumbing, electrical, the soft costs, the architect, the engineer, the investor, legal, loan costs. So this is a very expensive building to build. And if all of those units are market rate, if you can see the bottom of this, if we built the Ellery today, it wouldn't be feasible, even at market rate rents. And so the question is, how do we actually make buildings feasible? Um, so, right, even so we have rents that are relatively high in this neighborhood. And the question is, what are the components that actually made this building feasible? Right? There's some things we can't change, but there's some things we can. And so in the Ellery's case, with 330 units and 750 square foot on average apartments, um, we think about what it would take to make a building feasible. Here, they're $230 million in the hole. It's a $340 million building, right? So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money at risk on the developer and the lender's side. So when we think about this, I'm going to let Ed actually walk through a development that got to feasibility, but these are some of the components. And so I usually do this exercise where I ask people, well, what would they change to try to make this development feasible? And so I might just actually ask if people can put in the chat so everything you see that's highlighted yellow, you could change. So what would we change to actually make this development feasible? And could we add affordable units to make it work? And so I'm wondering if maybe some people want to tell me what of these things they would change to make it feasible. And I wonder if I can look to see if
Happy to moderate the Q&A
yeah.
to help. So reminding folks to please put your responses in the Q&A. Someone was asking if it's possible to zoom in just a little bit on the chart.
Let's see if I can do that. I actually think I can do it here.
Maybe if you can read out some of the things that are flexible or things that folks can change, that might be helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, literally anything. So the number of units, the size of the units, the amount we're paying for site work or hard costs or soft costs, the amount we're paying for staffing or insurance or utilities or taxes.
We have some responses coming in. Someone said developer equity.
Yeah.
Do you want
And
to
would it,
address them all by one, or should I keep going?
yeah, please,
So it
just
was developer equity. Somebody said maybe I try changing the non-affordable rents,
Mhm.
perhaps a small increase to help cover the affordable rents.
Yeah. And I'll just
Um, and
share.
then someone mentioned government assistance, and then perhaps making about 50% affordable, 60 to 80% AMI. So,
And I'll pull up the exercise so that way I might be able to increase to make it larger. Um, is that I hope that's better. Um, so that yeah, so there are many things we can change. I thank you for putting that in the chat. And so we can take a look at some of those things, right? So if we make the units a little bit smaller, um, so let's say the units are 650 square feet, right? All of a sudden, we've saved $70 million. Um, right? If we can somehow reduce the hard costs, maybe that's labor, maybe that's materials, and make it $450 a square foot, then we've saved more money, right? But here's the question: what does that change? How does that change affect other elements of the building, right? So if we make the units smaller, then we're probably charging lower rents, right? If we're um, reducing the quality of the materials, that might also add to maintenance on the operating side, right? So I think it's just thinking about these various things and how we work them out. But one of the things that's happening today his insurance costs are going through the roof, right? And so that's increasing costs, right? So if we had built the Ellery 5 years ago, interest rates would have been half what they are today. So one of the points I'm trying to make here is that um, these things are constantly changing, and if it's a 5 year cycle to build a building, those things are changing, and somebody's taking the risk. But what I want to share is actually the Ellery was a 421A building, so a building that included 82 units of affordable. So 82 of the 330 units were affordable, and the developer got a tax abatement for including those 82 units. Um, so what does that mean? That actually almost made the building feasible. You add to that then more subsidy um, from the city in terms of low interest financing, and then the building becomes feasible, right? When we think about energy efficiency, for example, it might cost more upfront during construction to have solar panels or better windows or a tighter seal on the facade, but that might save us 20 or 30% on the operations as we go forward, right? So all of these different components are changing to make a deal more or less feasible. So I just wanted to share that just to kind of get our minds working on the components of a development and then also how um, we might try to get to feasibility. And this is what cities, what developers, what lenders, what agencies are doing all the time, right? And so if we give an incentive to reduce the taxes, does that make the building feasible in order to have more affordable units, for example, in a high interest rate environment? So they're all different kinds of ways we can, make assumptions about how to get a development feasible. And Ed will walk through one particular deal, which I think will be important. But I'll go back to the presentation, and then maybe we could take a couple of the questions now, if that's because I see a number of them coming through. So um, we
Mark,
can
this
we
is
can do that.
Kendra. Yeah, I was going to say somebody brought up a couple of things. Where in the table is the profit for the developer? So maybe there's a moment here to talk about how developers make money and how they even pledge some of their profits for the long term as a loan. And
Yeah.
then also, did this project have tax credits, low-income housing tax credits?
Yeah, so this development did not have tax credits. Its only source of I would say incentive from the city of New York in the form of a tax abatement. Um, and and so the units had a certain percentage of affordability, but it didn't have other kinds of subsidy. And then, one of the things that this exercise does not do is, right, this is a snapshot, but in many cases, right, so the $34 million that the developer put up because the bank wasn't going to fund 100% of this development, they're not going to get back for 7, 8, 10, 15 years, right? So they're taking that risk of a payback later on. But that's not money that's up front, right? They're getting their money back from the cash flow once the development's done. So we usually think about developers' money as a return on investment. And I think sometimes there's this notion of the greedy developer. If a developer makes a 6% return, there's no reason to take all this risk, right? Just put it in a money market account or put it in the stock market, which has done like 10 to 12% in the last couple of years. So there's a cost for taking that risk, and there's a payback time that could be very long. So you wouldn't see necessarily the developer's profit here. It's coming from the cash flow in the long term.
And then lastly, Marc, what about land or in New York City's case, air and land,
Yes.
that acquisition opportunity?
Yeah, and so I'm sorry if this is a little bit hard to read, but land costs are here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but land costs in Manhattan, can run anywhere from $300 to $1,000 a square foot just to acquire the land. So in this case, the land would have been $173 million. And so that's one of the things when we talk about municipally owned land, imagine being able to defray that much cost from a development and how much more affordability or other incentives you might be able to get given that. So that's one of the things that makes development very hard. Land in a lot of cases in Manhattan is more than the construction cost, the hard construction cost. So to the extent that publicly owned land, land from beneficial owners like churches, nonprofits, other city agencies, is another way of trying to make a deal more affordable. So what are some of the considerations? And I'll just go through this very quickly in order to turn it over to Kendra. But when we're talking about a development, I ask myself a number of questions, right? So who are you, right? So we just basically underwrote a deal, right? The LRE, we tried to get to feasibility. We thought about elements of it. We thought about what we would change. But the question is, who are you, right? Because if you're the lender, you're going to look at this very differently, right? You're putting your money at risk. You're not going to give 100% of the cost to build it. You might give 60 or 70% of the cost to build it and expect somebody else to come up with the other 30 so that you're not at risk, right? So you're going to look at the development very differently if you're the lender. If you're the city, what are the decisions you're making about giving density or a tax abatement or other incentives? Like, is this building actually doing the things you want it to do, and is it worth those incentives? If you're the developer, are you willing to take the risk, right? If you're the community member, is this a development that is going to enhance your neighborhood or the number of people that might be able to access housing in your neighborhood, right? So we're all going to look at it differently. We're all going to get to feasibility differently, and we might not agree. And so when we change those variables, we have to think about who we are, right? If you're the insurance provider, you also have a big hand in whether this building gets built or not, right? Like, are you going to insure it? Is it risky? Is it, in a climate vulnerable place, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are some of the reasons the costs will go up and go down. And we have to think about, in every case, what is everybody's goal? So we have a number of mechanisms. If we want types of development that fit what we want to see in a neighborhood. So we have subsidies, we have variances, In some cases, like in the Williamsburg case, the city took care of the infrastructure in order to defray the cost so that there could be more affordable units in the development and so that the development would be feasible. So they're reducing the risk in order for the building to be built. Ownership structures, land transfers, um, right? If you're the lender, it could be financing terms, right? So we have actually New York City agencies that can provide long-term financing at lower interest rates than banks or in conjunction with banks, um, city-owned land, et cetera. So we have lots of different ways we might um, intervene to get a development done. Tax abatements, waivers, density bonuses, et cetera. So we have a number of ways of doing that. Those are kind of the tools we might have to get buildings built, to incentivize the kind of buildings we want. We also have sticks, right? So do we want these buildings built? And if they get built, what are the ways we want them built? So what are our sticks? Design standards, right? How does it hit the street? Does it have a public presence? Does it have ground floor retail? Um, you know, does it provide benefits to the community? Should we mandate that it have affordable housing in it? Um, right, those are some of the things we can do. We can do agreements related to taxes, neighborhood amenities, public access. We can limit the profit of a developer if they're taking certain kinds of subsidy in order to make the units more affordable. We can restrict the uses. So it might be specifically for special needs populations, for seniors, for frail elderly, for others. And then we can restrict incomes to say, like, we want these units to be affordable to a certain band, right? And we might want certain community benefits to come out of the development. So I just wanted to do that overview so that Kendra could talk very specifically about some of the New York City specific policies, both past, present, and potentially future. We're in a really interesting moment right now where certain incentives have expired and certain ones are new. So if there are a couple of questions before that, before I hand it over to Kendra, I'm happy to answer them. But I'm also, aware of the time. Are there a couple questions we might want to answer?
Yeah, there are a few questions, and then maybe we can move on to Hendra. One was a slide that you had earlier, that was showing the different percentages of housing. I think someone wanted some clarity about how some of them weren't adding up to 100%. I think it might have just been because you had it separated as rental versus owners.
Yes. So that's going to be, sorry to go back like this.
Yeah, no problem.
Apologize. Um, sorry, this one.
That one there. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily going to be 100%. It's going to be close because we're not, like in terms of these units kind of changing over time.
Correct.
Um, but yeah.
Okay, I think that provides some more clarity. Um, there was um, there were questions about developer fees and profits, which you already touched on. Um, somebody had asked, I think you'd mentioned risk, and they said risk is a tricky word. What experience do you have with projects actually failing? I don't know if that's something that you'd be able to address, and I think we can move on to Kendra after that.
Sure. Yeah, I think the three of us definitely have experienced failure. And sometimes, and it comes in different forms. So the financial crisis created quite a few failures in housing, right? And this is the 2008 financial crisis, because banks stopped lending, right? Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Bank of America, you know, um, stopped lending. Actually, even a couple of years ago with Republic Bank and Signature, if you have a construction loan in process with a bank when it is experiencing trouble, that could completely stop your development, right? COVID, certainly, right? So there's certain things you might not be able to predict that are beyond your building. And we've had actually quite a few. Right, the expiration of 421A, for example, you plan a building, you're about to start construction, it expires, and you underwrote the building one way, and then a program basically has disappeared. So there are a number of instances. We could talk very specifically about even specific buildings where that's happened, but it's tough. And sometimes you'll see a building that started construction and has sat for years with nothing happening. In a lot of cases today, right, you underwrite a building in 2019 and you have a 4.5% interest rate, right? But it's floating. So interest rates double to 8.5, which means that the bank is going to stop lending when it gets to its limit that it promised you in its loan agreement. And then they expect you, as the developer or the investor, to kick in any money for cost increases or any other costs. And there just might not be that money. The building might now be infeasible. So there are many different reasons for a building to fail, but we've had a number of great examples lately between COVID, interest rate rise, and general inflation in construction costs. Okay, so I will, if there's
Mark Gordon has his hand raised, but I don't know how to ask the question. Maybe the
Well,
moderator.
I think we're gonna move on to Kendra, and then we'll be able to get Mark's question. Unless Mark, if you can please put your question in the Q&A, would appreciate it.
Okay.
And I do see a lot of great Q&As once I'm done speaking, and maybe when Ed's talking, I can try to address some of those as well. So thank you very much
Absolutely.
for all the feedback that we're getting. And that leads me to my introduction. I'm Kendra Stensven. I'm an adjunct professor at NYU, where I teach an affordable housing development course. It's a continuing education course, number 3 in a series of 6. So if you're really into this topic, you can sign up for continuing ed as well and learn more about this, because it's really hard to cover it in 90 minutes, but we're doing our best to give you a good intro. I professionally have worked for developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, Jonathan Rose companies, and the NHP Foundation, for example. I've also worked across different markets. I've worked in New York City, New York State, and also places like Boston, Florida, and Chicago. So I've seen it across the board. And I do have to say, having worked in other jurisdictions, New York City does have sets the bar high in terms of our agency and their ability to try and do new things and get deals completed. So we live in a great place for that. Let's see. How do we progress? Mark, do you want to run this forward
Yeah,
for me?
I can run it for you.
Okay. I mean, I could too, but as long as you get me the starting point.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Oh, sorry. Excuse me. I thought that was another one in between. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today, there are a lot of different ways. Mark already explained some of the incentives and some of the sticks that go along with it. I'm going to dive deeper into a few of those things. So one of them is operating subsidies in terms of how to improve the income so that you can make a financially feasible project, to make it financeable. So we'll talk a bit about those. And then we're also going to talk about capital subsidies, direct into that cap stack, money that can help bridge that gap between a traditional deal and an affordable deal. And also briefly talk about the low-income housing tax credit program, because a lot of the resources we've talked about today are very specific to New York City, but the federal low-income housing tax credit program is a resource that the city and the state administers on behalf of the federal government, and it has produced the most amount of housing in America to date compared to any other housing program. So just to compare, we went over that example of how to make something feasible, but this is going to be a chart that shows generally how a market rate sourced project and an affordable housing source project line up differently. I think this must have a lot of tabs in it. So one thing I want to point out off the bat is that sponsors or developers always have money in the deal, whether it's affordable or market rate. So there's always risk. It's rare that somebody's going to do this with no risk involved. And then we also have equity in both types of deals. Now, the equity in a market rate deal is going to be more typical private equity. It'll come from a variety of sources, usually private. We don't know oftentimes. There's usually a rate of return required greater than what you can earn with a treasury. So we know today that that's a higher number. So investors want a higher rate of return, usually double digit. There's equity in an affordable housing deal too, if it's involved with the low-income housing tax credit program. And that is a bank or an insurance company or anyone who pays taxes, federal taxes, will buy the credit, and that converts into equity to build the project. But what I want to, the biggest part of all of this is the debt. Affordable housing projects can't earn as much income as a market rate development because their rents are limited, which means their income is limited. So they can only raise a certain amount of debt. And that's why this is usually a smaller portion than overall. Now, every deal is a little bit different. And what I really wanted to show you here was a piece of lasagna, but it's kind of close to dinner and I didn't want to make you hungry. But that's really what affordable housing is. It's a multi-layer capital stack, and has requirement or has gaps in it that require subsidy. So that's why you see grants here too. That's why you see debt that looks like subsidy that looks like debt. So a lot more layers in this layer cake or lasagna, but we won't talk about food for now anymore. All right, I'm ready for the next one. And then when it comes to the low-income housing tax credit equity, this is that federal program I mentioned that is administered on behalf of the state and the city. This is oftentimes used to build housing in New York City. And it can be paired in that 80-20 deal. Not every project does it, but if you're already meeting the requirements of one program, the 429A program, formerly known as, why not try to get a little bit more equity out of it if you're already reducing the rents and limiting the incomes for those 20% units. So this is different than private equity because it's not private. It's very well known that banks and other federal taxpayers want to buy these credits and put their money into affordable housing. So the federal government, based on our population in New York State, tells us that we get X amount of credits per year. Then the city and the state divvy out how much they get to distribute in their own allocations. And then from there, they usually have a qualified allocation plan, which is how they decide which projects to fund, because there is a limited amount. We can't fund them all. The same goes with tax-exempt bonds. Based on our population, the state is granted a certain amount of tax-exempt bond ability to grant it. Then they have to decide whether they want it to be for bridges and tunnels or other tax-exempt projects, but housing is usually a portion of it. The city and the state decide how much they want to split up, and then they use those bonds to also provide debt to projects. That's that must pay debt that we saw in the last chart. So the city and state agency allocate the low-income housing tax credits to developers. They receive that award. The developer sells that tax credit to the investor, and that's usually in, we've seen it between like 80 and sometimes over $1 per credit. And you're asking yourself, why do developers pay more, or why do investors pay more than $1? It's because they're not just buying the credit, they're buying depreciation, they're buying interest write-offs. So they're buying a little bit more of a bundle of goods. The equity is then used to pay for the construction, the soft costs, the developer fee, everything goes into building an affordable housing project. And then at the end, the investor gets those benefits back. They get the tax credits, they get the depreciation, they get the interest write-offs. And in minimum, the project has to stay in compliance for 15 years. So this is a big part of what builds housing in New York City, but also across the country. Next, yeah.
Yeah, and Kendra, before we move on, just because I don't want to assume everybody knows every term.
Yeah.
So 80-20 means 80% market rate, 20% affordable, and that's a program that was used very widely in New York City, that came with tax incentives. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that 80-20 meant 80% market, 20% affordable in buildings across New York City.
Thank you, Mark. I'm gonna go through this a little bit fast just because we've already talked about debt sizing. But based on what happens with you've got lower rents to begin with. You don't have market rents, you have lower rents. So already your NOI is lower, which is why we were only able to raise so much debt. So how do we offset that? We offset that with lower interest or loans, which can be those tax exempt bonds. It can be Freddie, Fannie, HUD agency debt products that are generally have favorable underwriting terms compared to market rate commercial mortgages. But we can also reduce, click on this a few more times. You can also reduce the property taxes. So you're having lower income because you can't charge as much rent, but you're going to have lower expenses by reducing those property taxes. So I'm going to get into a little bit of what those updates are today, because those are new changes that are, you've all been hearing about, but I'll go through the details. So on the next slide, we've already talked about rents a little bit, rents of a family of four. I did have a couple other things to point out down in the bottom as a point of reference. So when you think about 30% AMI, that's a very low income person. That rent was set at a certain amount. As a reference, HUD has fair market rents established for the metro region set at 2752, and they have a data set that they use to calculate that. So it seems low, which is why I also referenced the market rates according to apartments.com, which is more like 52.59. So you can see here that market rent amount of 52.59 is somewhere between 120% AMI and 165% AMI. So that just shows we need to have a lot more of the under 100 units in order to meet the affordability needs of our city. Not everyone can afford. There are no apartments being built naturally at 100% AMI and below. All right, then we will talk. I just want to show you also this next chart where it shows these income bands that Marc already showed you. Click a few more times and it brings up some arrows here. Okay, so there are gaps. So if we as developers are building buildings with 30, 40, 50, 60% of AMI, we can only, the dark purple is the top and the bottom for where somebody must qualify income-wise. So if somebody doesn't qualify for 30, that they make too much, but they're just over, they're actually not going to qualify for 40 because they make too little. So you see these gaps here. That's why it's not a perfect program. But I also wanted to illustrate this too, because those gaps, those bands are quite narrow. So if somebody makes below that purple amount, they don't get into the qualification point. But if they make just over, they don't necessarily jump into the next band either. So that's what I wanted to point out with this particular chart. Now into tax incentives in particular, we have formerly known as, well, it's not known, it was the 421A. 421A started in 1971 as a program specifically to build housing, because New York City experienced a serious drop in any housing production in the 60s. And so this was just a way to get housing to be built in general. Over time, it was modified to address affordable housing in particular, less so just market rate production. And 421C is also another tax abatement program specifically for low-income housing that was established in 1993. And when I say established, it has to pass the state, it has to be passed by the state legislature and approved by state government and then enacted by New York City. So we've taken these federal program or state programs and enacted them. 485X is the new version of 421A, and I have a chart explaining those differences coming up. And then the new also is 467M, and that is to incentivize developers to convert commercial properties into housing with an affordable component. This next chart I'll have for reference for when you want to dive deeper into the history of 421A, but it does talk about the different changes that happened over time, which is important to note because, like I said, it started as a housing program, and then it evolved into more of an affordable unit production program. And then it expired in June of 2022, which is why we're at the 485 today. Okay, click through a few more there, Marc. Thank you very much. And then the next chart is just a quick illustration of, okay, I have to click a few more times. I didn't realize everything was, okay. So program began in 1971. You can see here that that's why I needed some iterations, because we had dips in production and they needed to incentivize again, and then another dip and they needed to incentivize again. And this could have been because market conditions, higher interest rates, higher costs of land for whatever reason. It was amended to adjust and try to bring up that supply again. But you can see here too, with an incentive program like this, it never produced the same amount of housing that we had in the 1920s. There was just we're not making up for the same additions of supply that we had in the past. So the new 485X on the next slide is modified. It increases the tax exempt period from 35 years, which was under 421A, to 40 years. So you get a longer benefit for your taxes. It addresses both rental and ownership housing, and it adds requirements for construction and service wages, ensuring that there's a minimum wage requirement. And lastly, the affordability requirements are scaled depending upon the size and project location. So in a nutshell, there's 3 different rental categories depending upon the size of your project. And also the 150 plus addresses Manhattan, Western Queens, and parts of Brooklyn specifically. I'm not going to read this chart, but this will be available to you, but it talks about how you have different affordable levels, the more affordable and at different rates. Versus the 420 in the past was just, it was blanket for all over the city. So this kind of made specific concessions to certain parts of the city. All right. No, the new 467M is also a product available to incentivize developers to convert commercial buildings, not including hotels or Class B lodging, Class B multifamily. It's a partial tax exemption, and it is front-loaded so that they can try to incentivize conversions and delivery of units before 2029, even though it is a program that does go through to the 2030s. You have to have at least 25% affordable in it. And while there is no construction wage requirements, there are prevailing wage requirements for service workers in the buildings if there are 30 units or more. Right. And that is and again, shameless plug for our continuing ed program if you want to dive deeper into that.
There you go. Excellent. All right. So
should we just because there were quite a number of programs, if there are any particular questions we might want to answer before we move to Ed?
And I'm going to shift into answering some of those questions now too, and type them in.
That's great.
Yeah, so in the interest of time,
Kendra, I think there were some questions specifically on them, and Edward was doing a great job of answering them in real time in the chat.
Oh, perfect.
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you.
I only got to a few just because I wanted to wait for Kendra's presentation. I was hoping that she was going to cover quite a few. And then there's some others that I think we can just probably table to the general Q&A. So, yeah, so I feel like there's plenty more, Kendra, you'll probably be able to dive into, but otherwise we can tackle them all at the very end. But I want to thank Borough President's Office for inviting us all here. Eric, Porfirio, Jesse, thank you so much. Dean Norman as well, and Kendra for your infinite wisdom as you've been able to share even up to the lead up for this presentation. So I'm going to give a brief on myself. So I have a fairly vast spectrum of development advisory and underwriting and consulting experience, not only just really in terms of affordable housing, but I've covered a number of other food groups, including hospitality and hotels, industrial, self-storage, in addition to office and retail and mixed-use properties. So I've seen quite a bit of hodgepodge throughout my career, which has made things somewhat exciting, fascinating, intriguing, nerve-wracking all at the same time. But for our purposes today, we're going to certainly dive into an example of a case study. And I will clarify one thing, Marc. This is sort of an example of where we're at the unique point in the underwriting for this hypothetical scenario, which is, let's say it's based on a true story, but the exact address is protected, is hidden to protect you from the, I guess, from those who are looking for not all the exact information on this deal. But I will say that when you get to the end of this example, I want to show how, as much as 45 may be of a certain benefit to the system, there are still some challenges and concerns. in terms of how it's impacting our underwriting for this project. So essentially, you're going to see an example of how we get to a place where you see the limits of having an affordable project in terms of not having enough of the income sort of variety that certain programs may have. And we could discuss this more with Kendra and Marc, just as far as just in terms of the AMI requirements. So this case study, again, just hypothetical, but it's based on a true story. We're using an example of a site in the Upper West Side. The goal was to design 80 units, 100% affordable housing units in this particular area. We can click on the next slide. And so the developer, there's multiple pieces. You might want to just keep clicking because I think there are going to be some call outs. Yep, there we go. So we have total size of the building, right? We have the amenities. Essentially, this is designed to be a project where we would include 8,000 square feet of retail. Although in the instance of this actual underwriting, it's actually going to be a proposal for a nonprofit that actually wants to take up commercial space that is trying to negotiate for a substantially low rent. And I'm going to show how that impacts the underwriting later on, because you're going to see a very low number at the very end. But this is actually part of the actual case that makes this part of a challenge. But otherwise, you look at this, seems to be a very nice building in terms of what the rendering may ultimately produce. 10,000 square feet of amenities. Again, this is what an example of what some of the newer affordable may look like in terms of housing with some level of dignity. It would have a fitness center, some sort of general lounge space and lobby, self-storage facility as well. And the idea is that, again, aside from the local nonprofit that's looking to take a significant amount of space, there would still be, perhaps maybe some room for a retail cafe, but that has not been factored into this case. Another point to look at, if you look at the heights here, we make the assumption that this is zoning for R8A. We didn't include that, but that's considered high density zoning. So buildings 9 to 10 stories, give or take. These typically have what we call quality housing requirements that generally might look shorter and wider, which is sort of the case for this sort of design, but otherwise are looking to provide quality or greater housing spaces within the design requirements as per HPD and other folks involved with sort of the design for these types of projects. This doesn't include, it's not a reference to inclusionary housing. I'm sure many of you may be familiar with that term, but otherwise it's just really speaking to the quality and size of the overall design and development of the site itself. As I mentioned before, we're going to show an example. We're going to show exactly ultimately how this might be impacted by the tax components for this project. But I just want to give a sense of just some of the basics here for what's going into this project. All right, so this is the unit breakdown, right? As you can see here, we've got 10 studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, pretty straightforward for the unit mix here. One of the things I want to also add for this project, the goal to make it 100% affordable. This is a project that would fall under what's called, as we're looking at this project, it's an extremely low and low income affordability program project, which is also known as ELA. The idea is that the program would fund new construction for low income multifamily rentals with a minimum of 80% of the units at low income rents. So essentially this mix here for each of the units are going to be at some level of affordability, anywhere from about 30% of the area median income up to about 80%. Right. Trying to see what we have here. You want to go back for a second? Okay. Oh, you're just showing. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, you're just fast forwarding. That's good. That's good. And then you'll notice we have the so you have the AMI bands here for the project. You have the average rent. And then what I want to note here is the New York 1515 program, which is typically set aside for about 16 or anywhere from 15 to 20% of the units, providing supportive housing or some housing for those that were recently homeless. Part of the plan for this, again, is to, again, provide some level of greater affordability for the project itself. Again, as you can see, these income levels, you can see the rent levels, and our objective for this project was to show that we are providing that average rental income to be somewhere within that 50 to 60% of the AMI, which is going to be required in order to be eligible for all the different benefits that we would be able to be eligible for some of the funding that is offered by the city. That will ultimately show that there are some impacts and challenges with the cash flow itself. I guess you want to go back. Let's see, where are we? I think the previous. Okay, so these are the costs that go into the project itself. We usually factor these into what we call sources and uses. But these are essentially the uses for the project. So we need a certain amount of money to acquire the land for the site itself. There were some questions before in the chat about, what percentage of the project cost would be land. In this case, this would be 5%. But there are other cases where if you're a part of an RFP or request for proposal and you're a developer, there's a good chance this might be a city-owned asset. And part of my response to that question is, therefore, you might be paying a ground lease and you may not have an acquisition cost, but there are other costs to bear that you have to factor in, depending on the types of finishes that you're putting into the project, that would then have you focus more on the hard costs for the project. So that land cost may vary and also may depend on where in the city you are. So if it is also privately held site that's somewhere on the Upper West Side versus somewhere in the Bronx or somewhere in certain parts of Queens, that land value may vary based on the private owner. But if it's a city-owned asset, in many cases, that acquisition cost may be significantly less or zero, and you'll be factoring in to pay most likely some sort of ground rent on the land itself. We have soft costs, which are typically tied to third parties. In other words, everyone from the environmental reports that need to be done, the appraiser, geotechnical work that needs to be done, property condition report, appraiser, of course, the architects and the design elements of the project itself are among those costs, as well as some of the costs for property taxes at a certain point in time in the project. And then there's ultimately a developer's fee. A question also came up in the chat regarding that. For affordable development, you're typically going to see that, and this is not just for New York State, it kind of varies across the country. There are certain thresholds that you have, but there's a certain range in which it may be deemed to be acceptable, especially if you're applying for LIHTC credits. So in the instance of this particular project, the developer wanted somewhere around a 10% developer fee. Members of this team are currently underwriting at about a 7 to 8%. Whereas in a market rate project, you typically will see the developer fee would be significantly lower, and that's because you're seeing a higher cash flow. So the lower amount for a developer fee would be probably somewhere in the 4% to 6% of the total hard and soft costs for the project. So in case that question has been percolating, that's typically what we would see. And again, state by state, it varies. I'm sure Kendra has seen that this may vary depending on what you might typically see in terms of what a developer fee may look like. And this is going back to what I was saying before about permanent sources. So again, there are a number of great programs that are offered through the city. So for this particular deal, we are looking at funding from the Housing Development Corporation, both for permanent first mortgage, as well as there's construction sources as well that we would also be looking to tap into, which again would come from HDC with significantly lower interest rates to finance this, better than where the market would go. But as you can see here, these are all primarily sources coming from the various agencies. RESOA funding coming from City Council, so there's an assumption that the City Council member would be supporting this project. I'll note alongside the tax credit equity, RESOA funding is sort of considered an equity, even though it's a low interest loan at essentially 0%. But we do treat it as equity in the capital stack. And then there's what you see here, what we call a deferred developer fee. If there's a question about what that actually means, which is that normally on a market rate deal, a certain percentage of your developer fee or all of it essentially is contracted to be taken at closing, whereas for many affordable projects, you're deferring a portion of that fee over a certain period of time in the project itself. But this is what that deferred fee happens to look like. Sometimes there's a schedule that shows, especially for projects that are taking tax credits that are deemed to have a land use restriction to be affordable over 15 years. There's a certain period of time where you'll show exactly what amount of this, let's say $947,000 will be deferred. Might be over the first 5 years. It could be over 10 years, but broken up. So that's just to give some clarity to that piece. We can go to the next slide. All right, we talked about that before. All right, and so we have some information here as well. This is tying to essentially the operations in year one. So now the project has now been completed, and now essentially we're beginning to bring in revenue to the project. One of the things that we are looking at in terms of community space income, as I mentioned before, that is that low number that you could see. Part of the challenge that our developer is actually discussing is that, could there be a greater way to bring in some greater revenue given the location of this site? But this community nonprofit is looking for a certain benefit, and but yet that annual amount, actually it might have changed since we've worked on this, but it should be a little higher than that, but it's still significantly lower than what would be sort of substantial income relative to the residential income that you're receiving from the rents to the property itself. As you can see, looking down, you see our expenses. So you have your income adding to 879, and then you have your your expenses, management fees, utilities. So you're looking at, a building reserve to keep up with the maintenance for the property itself, general management fee for the site itself. And then what's interesting is that you notice that there is no number for taxes. That's not normal. There should be some sort of an abated number over time. What happens to be the case here is that in the underwriting for this project, as you can see, the available cash flow is already relatively low because this is an affordable project. Now, if we have to add some level of an abated number, we are going to be even pressed into a harder sort of scenario. So this is an example where when you have a 100% affordable project, as we've brought it up to the client, we've made the argument as to whether or not there could be some room perhaps for some level of market or workforce funding into this deal if you wanted to pencil out a certain way. And ultimately, over the remaining 15 years of the project, you begin to see that it's evident that there wouldn't be sufficient cash flow to make this project work. And this is part of the challenge that we typically come across in a number of cases. And so what I wanted to make kind of clear in this instance is that in a lot of cases over time, you're going to have a project where you have to kind of work through the unit mix. And if you're looking for a certain level of affordability, you're going to have to begin to determine on the underwriting right from the beginning, is there some level or some basis for, being creative, whether it's with your equity sources, is there ways to push down some of the ongoing expenses for the project so that we can get this to be operable in a way that we'll see a reasonable enough cash flow that will make it make sense. Click to the next slide, I think. Let's see. Yeah.
And so just before you go on, here I just want to note that you saw the rents anywhere from 1,000 to, let's say, 1,600 a month. The operating expenses are almost $600 a month. And so that's the other dilemma, right? If something goes wrong, if insurance goes up, if units become vacant and you need to repaint them or replace them, that's also one of the places where a dilemma comes up in affordability, because you lose a lot of the cushion you might, in higher rent development. So there isn't not as much margin for when certain costs go up. So I just wanted to mention that before we went to the long-term cash flow.
Right. It's just to that point, that's exactly it. I think it just shows that you're at a razor thin level of margin that just puts you in a very precarious situation throughout the ongoing management of the building itself. And so that's just to show how delicate some of these projects can happen to be. And this project example is part of one of the classes that I'm teaching at the moment. I teach development process, and we are looking at an element of this. And I've actually divided the class into 4, saying rather than 100% affordable, initially the developer wanted to look at this project as a 70-30 market rate to affordable project. However, given the fact that they are experienced, they wanted to kind of go through the through the process and know all the agencies and have been successful at developing supportive housing and mixed income housing with a greater, deeper affordability. But just given the constraints, given some of the challenges with financing in the private market, they certainly wanted to see what the city agencies can offer. And at this point, they're having a little bit of a general challenge even on the 100% affordable side. Also, there may be an opportunity with the City of Yes program where there's additional density that might enable them to increase the unit for the project and maybe potentially add some additional cash flow to the project as well. But for the class itself, I left it to the students to determine if the client initially wanted to do a 70 to 30% split, would that make sense, or is there some other mix? And interestingly enough, we're seeing a mixture of anywhere from a greater skew of affordability to 50-50 affordable to market. And what's interesting is that we're going to begin to see exactly how we can tackle this cash flow challenge and figure out what are some of the other options available, even if the proposals they come up with may not be eligible for all the incentives provided by the city. With those that they are eligible for, perhaps there might be some sort of an answer. And I think that's what we're all trying to figure out in many instances here.
Great. So I see that we have just maybe 6 or 7 minutes left. So maybe we do have time for some questions.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Edward, for the presentation as well. I can jump in the chat and get a couple of questions. Someone had asked how much land is owned by the city and how is the use of that land prioritized? And where does use of this land stand in priorities?
I mean, that's a great question. And I actually don't know the answer in terms of the percentage. One of the things I think that is a little bit hard when we say publicly owned land is each agency owns its land and has different priorities. And so some might be owned by the sanitation department, the fire department, the school district. So not all public land is created equally. Some of it's on a ground lease. So it's a hard question to answer. And sometimes you have to do it agency by agency. And some agencies are more focused on sort of the housing crisis versus, let's say providing educational space or other things. One thing that's interesting was today it was announced that the city has land in the meatpacking district, and it's going to try to so the last meat packers in the district are going to move out of that city leased site, and it was announced that that could be 600 units of affordable housing. So we're seeing, I think, because of City of Yes and because of the real crisis we have with affordability, a greater look at the available public assets. But I actually don't know the exact percentage of city-owned land.
Thank you. Somebody had a question about obligations for like any type of aesthetics requirements for development. I don't know if you want to speak to that. I guess they're probably asking in like neighborhood context of what's already been built. Are there any restrictions or obligations?
And probably Kendra could probably talk about, I guess, HPD design guidelines that are specific. Is that probably what they're hinting at?
I mean, the look of it is
Yeah.
up to the architect, as long as they're complying with the regulations of city planning. Unless there's like a ULURP action or some other community board action that they might want the input to help, make it a win-win for everyone. But usually architects have the wherewithal to design within the context, contextually within the neighborhood. So, but there's no like you have to use this color brick or you have to use this color paint or anything like that.
All right.
If you want to be a good neighbor, you're going to try your hardest to be a good neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely. I really do think that covers most of the questions. I think there are some that maybe are actually geared for, and I will plug our land use and zoning training that'll be coming later this week. I would encourage folks to register for that one in case they have any questions, more specifically on those types of policies or zoning guidelines. So I think we'll probably be able to wrap now. I just again want to thank you, Dean Norman, Edward, and Kendra so much for being here. I found this very fascinating, very in-depth, and I hope that everyone has that same takeaway. So I just want to thank you. And before we go, I think there was a request for sharing the presentation. We will have the presentation and share this recording. So for folks who wanted to take another look at this, we'll be happy to get this up at the end of our leadership training week.
And you can share our contact information as well if people have follow-up questions.
Great. Thank you so much. I think you already got an invitation to a committee meeting, so careful what you wish for. Thank you all so much again. We really appreciate it. I don't know if you have any last words before we wrap. Otherwise, we'll say goodnight.
Can I say one more thing? Because I just did see a question. You know, we focused on and talked about the rental housing specifically. And, you know, unfortunately, I mean, for better or worse, most of the programs to create affordability are on the rental side, not on the ownership side. And there are a couple of reasons for it. One, rental, right, when it turns over, it stays affordable. Ownership, once you know that first owner gets it, there might be a period at which they can't sell or they can't sell for market rate, but then it goes back to the market. And so a lot of programs have been oriented towards rental because you get, in essence, more bang for your buck. But people are looking at ways to make home ownership, whether cooperative, condo, or single family, more affordable. It's just most of the programs are oriented towards rentals. I just wanted to say that.
And I know we didn't get to every question. I tried to type a few while Ed was talking, but don't want to leave those unanswered. So happy to follow up, whichever ways works for your office.
Thank you so much. We will share your contact info, and I'm sure we'll be able to share what we can.
Thank you. Happy to help.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. And please, if you are interested in land use and zoning or any of our other trainings, we do have a few more coming up. So with that, I'll say good night to everyone. Thank you so much and have a nice night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Take care.